chair the selection committee for this program. I'd like to thank our other committee members, Karen Alpha, Marco Brown, Hazel Russell. Sorry, they bring really good ideas, and we debate them and come up with 6 books every year. Thanks also to Card Carrying Books for their support, and to the library, to the church for letting us use the space. This is a program of the Friends of the Library. I presume you're all members, but if you are not, Kimberly will sign you up. It's the best deal in town, $5 for an individual, $10 for a family. Get you into the book sale on the first day. The book sale is like this well-oiled machine of fabulous things, thanks to Nancy and her crew. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yay, I can't keep your tongue long enough. Okay, so you'd already heard that the previous week, so if you didn't hear it this time, it's good. This week's book is an unfinished love story, a personal history of the 1960s by historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, presented by Cathy Patterson. Oh, I need to do one thing that I forgot, housekeeping. Someone left this lovely vessel a few weeks ago. If it's yours, please take it home with you. Okay. As you know, this year I asked our presenters a couple of new questions adapted from the New York Times by the Book column. Asked about her earliest library memory, Cathy said, "Before starting school, I remember looking forward to visiting the bookmobile, which made weekly visits to our neighborhood. These visits are still vivid in my memory, and I was in awe of all the books which were housed in the bookmobile, as well as the librarian who recommended books to me from time to time." So yet another book lover, library patron who started as a child. As far as a book that had an impact on her life, Cathy said, "One summer before years in high school, I read a biography of Thomas Jefferson written by Fawn Brodie. This was the first widely read biography which made the case that Jefferson had fathered a child by one of his slaves, Sally Heming. Growing up and being educated in Virginia, where Jefferson was celebrated as almost godlike, her account challenged the narrative I had been taught. The book caused quite an uproar, and it would take years for Ms. Brodie's account to be acknowledged as correct. Among the lessons I came to appreciate was that people are complicated, and Jefferson was certainly that, full of contradictions. But this book demonstrated that history, contrary to what some believe, is not static, and our interpretations can change over time as new sources of evidence come to light and methods for examining it are developed. That was so exciting to me. Why not share the enthusiasm for history by teaching, which is exactly what she did." Cathy has a BA in Social Studies Education from Virginia Tech and an MA in Administration from Mansfield. She retired from teaching AP World History and Theory of Knowledge in the Corning-Painted School District in 2017. That would be good. And currently enjoying volunteering in the committee and visiting her 2 grandsons as often as possible. Thanks for coming, Cathy. Thank you.
Before we begin, at the end of the front rows are baskets of different varieties of chocolate hearts. It occurred to me, so please take, actually you could take more than one, I think. I wasn't sure how many people would be here, so I think I'm covered. So there are different varieties, and the more you take, the less I'll have to bring home with me. So do me a favor. And I had forgotten a lot of that information that I gave Louise in the introduction, so I'll try not to repeat maybe some of the things that she said. But the hearts are because, you know, Valentine's Day is right around the corner, and this is a love story. Obviously, between Doris and Dick Goodwin, it's also a love story, their love story with the history of the United States. And I think perhaps it's meant to inspire us to continue our love story with America. It is a biography, it's a memoir, more so of Dick than of Doris, but there's a lot of Doris's background and her history in the book as well. And it's definitely a political history. I'm just curious, how many of you have read or listened to the book?
3/4.
And there's a lot here, and I'm certain that there are going to be aspects of the book that I won't talk about, or may even not get quite right, so don't be afraid to call me out on that. And I want to make sure that we leave enough time at the end, because I am curious what sort of observations you have. I was alive during this time, maybe 1917, maybe not quite that old, but I was born in 1957. So obviously a lot of my memories are not very sophisticated, and I didn't understand the nuances of what was going on. Probably until, 1968, which, left a really vivid mark on all of our memories. So I'm particularly interested in your observations, if you were maybe a little bit older than I was during that period of the 60s, and sort of what your take on what the events might have been. So stop me if I don't stop myself, so that we have time to discuss that. You may have picked up from what Louise said at the beginning, my impressions are those of an elementary school student growing up in southeastern Virginia in the 1960s. My family, I don't think you could say they were politically active, but I'm pretty sure they were Republican. And even though they weren't activists, they voted on a regular basis. And one of the, points that I understand now that maybe I didn't understand then was this whole issue of desegregation and massive resistance that was taking place in a lot of southern states, and including Virginia. So maybe we'll get back to that at the end. So let's get started with the book. It's now or never. That was Dick Goodwin's remark, that it was time to begin this research project which Doris had been pushing him to do for so many years. There were over 300 boxes of memorabilia that he had collected through the course of his life, much of it about the administrations or campaigns that he worked with during the 1960s. John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and the campaigns of Eugene McCarthy and Robert F. Kennedy. So there was a lot to be unpacked, and perhaps he had been reluctant because of the way the 60s ended, and it brought up a lot of sort of bad memories about that particular period. And as we can appreciate, and many of you know, Doris was probably the perfect person to help him out with this project, and so that this book could be produced. She referred to the presidents that she has written about as my guys, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and of course, LBJ, who I think she will have the most to say about, being that coincides with some of Dick's experiences as well. Their own love story began in 1972. They met at Harvard. She was teaching a course on the American presidency, doing tutorials, running seminars, and Dick was there to write. And when they first met, he thought that she might be a graduate student, or at least that's what he said. But when she informed him that she was, an assistant professor, he said, well, he was just kidding. I think they both knew of one another's reputations at that point. She was familiar with Dick's reputation as a speechwriter, and they would sort of develop, they had a long conversation on that first meeting date, at, I think she said 5 hours long, and then they went out to dinner and the conversation continued. She found out that Dick was married. His wife, Sandra, had mental illness and had been, in and out of hospitals throughout her life. They had a son, Richard Jr., and as their friendship developed, about 6 months down the road, Sandra, I guess she checked herself out of the facility that she was in and committed suicide. So Doris stepped in to try to help Dick and his son sort of put their lives back together again. But he was obviously not in a position to make a long-term commitment at that time, although I think Doris had already crossed that bridge. So he moved back to Washington, D.C., and they kind of went their separate ways. But eventually they, about a year later, ran into one another again and rekindled their friendship and the romance, and were married in December of 1975. So that picture is they were married in Massachusetts, and obviously Ted Kennedy was one of the invited guests. There was probably a pretty distinguished guest list, I would imagine, at that particular wedding. Then they had to decide where to live, and Dick wanted to be in the country, Doris wanted to be in the city with all the amenities thereof. So they settled on Concord, Massachusetts, as a sort of compromise, because it would be close enough to Boston for Doris, but rural enough for Dick. And so that's where they made their life. They had 2 sons in pretty quick succession, and Doris eventually would join Dick in pursuing her writing career. Now back to the boxes. A little bit about their how they came together. There were 30 boxes that covered the Kennedy years. And when you think about that, that's a lot. That's 10 boxes a year for his presidency. But there was campaign information in that as well. When Dick started, or when he was asked to join the Kennedy campaign, he thought this is going to be a dead-end job. It's not going to go anywhere. He had, a pretty distinguished academic career. He was at Harvard Law School, took some time off and had a stint in the Army in between, and then returned to finish his law degree and became president of the Harvard Law Review. This is a blurry picture of all the other students who were a part of the Law Review, and you might be able to notice that there are 2 women among all those men. And the one on this end is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And so they were in law school at the same time, and what Doris did was she actually went and interviewed the lady at the other end. I think her name was Nancy Boxley, because she had access to her. I can't remember, I should have looked this up, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. At any rate, she didn't have access to her, so she talked to Nancy about the complications of being a female in this very male world and trying to make your way in this profession. So, and I might add that that's a pattern that Doris repeats throughout this examination of the boxes, that she would seek out some of the people who went through these experiences at the same time that, when Dick was writing about them or collecting information about them. And so that was just putting her craft as a historian, I think, to good use. Dick also was a law clerk for Felix Frankfurter, and he was a great inspiration to him. And Dick made the decision, he was kind of conflicted about what he was going to do after graduating. He felt like there must be more to life than going to work for a big law firm, and he would have had his choice being that he was the president of the Law Review. But he thought there was a higher purpose in life, and he was particularly interested in trying to close the gaps between what our country's ideals were and what the reality of people's lives were. So he was asked by Ted Sorensen, who was an aide to Kennedy and one of Kennedy's close friends, if he would join the campaign. And Sorensen found out about Dick because of Dick's investigation into this quiz show scandal. Now, I'm curious if any of you remember anything about that. But I guess quiz shows were all the rage in the 1950s. And there was a lot of speculation about, well, are these for real? And this Charles Van Doren, I think this show was 21, that this particular quiz show, he had been wildly successful. And so the speculation was that, there was kind of an inside job. These people who would win on these programs, and Dick actually proved that was the case. Charles Van Doren confessed that he had the answers to the questions ahead of time, and so that's how Sorensen came to figure out who Dick was. So the dead-end job would begin, and Kennedy really would become one of Dick's heroes. He helped him on a variety of speeches, and also coaching him through the debates. Believe it or not, the campaign didn't officially begin until September, back in that period. And it would be nice if we could return to that. I think we would all agree. They came up with Kennedy had the first campaign plane, the Caroline, and so Dick was, a party to the whole campaign, a small group who traveled around the country on the plane. There was a lot of talk about I know you've heard all the stories about the debates with Nixon, and there were 4 in 1960. Most, they even listened to the debates again and recognized that by listening, they seemed pretty even. But it was the contrast in the way they looked, these two candidates, and the sort of ill-at-ease nature of Nixon versus the confidence of Kennedy that seemed to make a lot of difference. After the third debate, it was late at night, and they headed to the University of Michigan, where Kennedy was going to make a speech the next day. And maybe they got there at about 2 o'clock in the morning and thought, well, we'll just get there and go to our hotels. They were surprised when there were thousands of students waiting at 2 a.m. to greet Kennedy. And there was no speech prepared for that particular occasion. But Kennedy kind of, I guess he, off the cuff, maybe you remember reading about this, delivered this little message to the young people in the audience. How many of you who are going to be doctors are willing to spend your days in Ghana? Technicians or engineers, how many of you are willing to work in the Foreign Service and spend your lives traveling around the world? On your willingness to do that, not merely to serve 1 or 2 years in the service, but on your willingness to contribute part of your life to this country. I think will depend the answer, whether a free society can compete. So whether or not it was consciously done, this was the birth of the Peace Corps. And 2 students in the audience, Alan and Judy Guskin, went out and they got all these signatures from students who wanted to be a part of such an effort, and presented them to Kennedy several days before the election. And this is what was the groundwork for the beginning of the Peace Corps. And for Dick, I think that was the essence of the Kennedy years, this idea of service instead of self. Dick was a part of the inaugural address. He coined those familiar phrases, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. The torch has been passed to a new generation. And I gather the speech was much more about foreign policy than it was domestic policy. One, I think, really interesting thing that happened, not so much during the inaugural speech, but during the inauguration parade, was there was a Coast Guard detachment that came through. And John F. Kennedy noted that, he said to Dick afterwards, he said, Did you notice that there were no black faces in that detachment? And Dick remarked, well, not really, I was so cold, that was all I could think about, it was how cold I am. So Kennedy said something has to be done about that. And that became a project for Dick to work on, and eventually led to a gentleman by the name of Merrill Smith becoming the first black cadet at the Coast Guard, who went on to have a really distinguished career. And his story is on display at the African American Museum of History and Culture in Washington, D.C. How many of you have been there? I haven't gotten there yet, but it's definitely something on the agenda. Dick, I just wanted to throw this up there. I'm not going to talk about it so much. But, you know, I think sort of this, everybody that was in the administration, or certainly key to the administration, watching Alan Shepard's flight in May of the first year in office was sort of a, you know, something they were very proud of, because this was an answer to some of the activity that had been going on in the Soviet Union. So this was sort of something that could be built on. Dick, one of the other areas that he was instrumental in was developing the Alliance for Progress, which was meant to turn the page on American relations with Latin America and help promote land reform and development in that part of the world. But he kind of messed up when he was there by having this, what was meant to be an informal meeting with Che Guevara, and you know, it was going to be totally off the record, and there was no, you know, big policy discussion. Che presented him with a box of cigars, and but there were translators and aides in the room, and the story gets out. Dick took a lot of flack about that, because it appeared as if maybe he, as a sort of assistant in the White House, was making policy in Latin America. And so it led to a bit of a demotion. He ended up headed over to the State Department as opposed to the White House. But he would still be available to help out. He and Jackie Kennedy became very close friends, and he helped in the organization of this dinner for the Nobel Prize winners in 1962. So he and Jackie collaborated on this, and you know, he's escorting her into the dinner. This is the dinner that where Kennedy, you know, uttered that famous quote that you know, this was the greatest collection of or gathering of human knowledge and talent in the history of the United States, with the exception when Thomas Jefferson died alone. So, so I'm sure you all heard that. Action on civil rights sort of was slow to come, and during the Kennedy years, although it was something that had been promised. That changed on Washington as more emphasis began to be given to the issue of civil rights. Interestingly, Dick and Doris were both in attendance at the March on Washington, although that was long before, they met, and neither one knew the other was there. And, Doris's remarks were, it was just such an uplifting day and a time when there was so much unity, and she was really happy to have been able to. She was, I think, doing a summer internship in DC that year, so that's why she was there. A very flattering, about that time, a very flattering article was published about Kennedy, and he was going to call the White House the next morning and, talk about, what some of the things that were in there to make sure that people were aware. He was just about to be named as the head of this committee it was the National Council on the Arts because of sort of the work he'd done with Jackie. And that would have put him back in the White House. So he was calling to really talk about that position. And when the secretary answered the phone, she said, the president is dead. He was killed in Dallas. Dick had no idea about that. And one of the terms that Doris titles her chapters with is kaleidoscope. And she talked, the point of that is something she sort of picked up from Teddy Roosevelt research. Roosevelt said, the turn of the kaleidoscope can either open an opportunity or block a future path, brighten prospects or darken the road. And so this definitely was a turn of the kaleidoscope, and like Teddy Roosevelt, who was vice president when McKinley was shot, this opens the door for LBJ when Kennedy was killed. So it's kind of an interesting thought, depending on which facet might show through in a movement of the kaleidoscope. Dick was a part of he didn't really know what to do, but he was a part of the arrangements for the funeral. They opened up the Library of Congress after hours to read about Lincoln's funeral because Jackie wanted things to be just like they were in the White House after Lincoln was killed. So they did, read the primary sources and found out how to set up the East Room. The brother-in-law of Kennedy, Sergeant Shriver, was in charge. He had also been the head of the Peace Corps. And so they were able to make things, prepare everything so when the family came back with JFK's body, it would be all set. The other task Dick was given was to figure out how to get an eternal flame at the gravesite. Jackie had wanted this because when they were in France, the French had an eternal flame in Paris. So he makes these calls to the Army. The Army kept explaining all the reasons why this wasn't going to be possible. It wasn't safe, they didn't have enough time, they'd have to go to Europe, that one excuse after the other. Dick would counter it. And finally, he told them, if you can design an atomic bomb, you can put a little flame on the side of the hill, and you can make it so she can light it. And in a matter of speaking, that is what happened, and the torch was passed, so to speak. Doris remembers watching the funeral and being very impressed by the composure and grace of Jackie Kennedy, as I think many people were at that particular juncture. So, now, what is a new frontiersman from the Kennedy administration supposed to do? There was definitely no love lost between the Kennedys and Lyndon Johnson. In fact, supposedly they called him Colonel Cornbone. This upset Doris, I think, as they began to look at the Johnson years because of her extensive connection with LBJ. And, you know, I think it had always been a bit of a sore point. And I think ultimately they decided that, you know, their experiences with both these men, Kennedy and respectively Johnson, really were, you know, had taken place in their youth. And I think we can all think back to, you know, particular people that maybe we had a great affinity for, people who were in the public eye or otherwise. And as we get older, maybe you have a little more realistic picture of faults and weaknesses of that person. And so I think they came to terms with they both were interacting with Kennedy and Johnson when they were at a relatively young age. So Dick asked, or Johnson asked Dick to stick around because he knew that he needed a good speechwriter, and you know, Dick made the decision to do so. Johnson's, you know, domestic program came to be known as the Great Society, and I was interested to read about the occasion when they kind of developed that term. You know, there was some argument about what's the best thing to call this. So Johnson liked to swim in the nude. So, you know, there was a White House pool, and that's it. Again, it's an indoor pool. I guess there was an outdoor pool at some point, but this one was indoors. And it was when Dick and Bill Moyers, also swimming nude with LBJ in the pool, they developed this term to refer to Johnson's domestic program. And it is kind of an interesting picture to have. You know, Johnson is definitely known for the war on poverty, and as we'll talk about, his civil rights work. He also was famous for being, you know, his mood could change very quickly. I think Bill Moyers, I think, referred to, he was 13 of the most complicated people, you know, you might ever meet. He could be up or down, effusive, withdrawn, complimentary, or accusatory, sometimes all within the same day. And Dick and both Dick and Doris experienced that at different times. They took, you know, many trips to LBJ's ranch in Texas, which they came to refer as the Lyndon Johnson Theme Park, or Linden Land. So he would bring people there, take them all around, you know, the ranch where he went to school, and so forth. it must have been quite an experience to be a guest at his house, which they were a number of times. The one of, I think, a key crisis in LBJ had been working on civil rights legislation all along, and perhaps is responsible for many of the pieces of legislation that we may be in the process of seeing being undone. That's another issue. But I think in Selma is when the issue of voting rights was really coming into play. You all perhaps have read about the ways African Americans were made to go through literacy tests, answer questions like how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, or how many seeds are in a watermelon, recite poetry, talk about the amendments to the Constitution, and sort of identify which one was which. And this violent, the protest, which became quite violent when the marchers in Selma were shot at, hit, and it was made plain for everyone to see, kind of brought this issue to its head. George Wallace was invited to the White House. He was governor of Alabama at that time. And he was given what became known as the Johnson treatment. Johnson was 6'4". I think Wallace was under 6 feet tall, maybe 5'7" or 8. But the issue was, how are we going to put down this violence? And it was thought that federal troops needed to go in, but Johnson needed to be careful about how that was offered. So he brings Wallace to the White House and he sits him down on a low sofa, and Johnson pulls up his chair where he can tower over Wallace. And he eventually gets in your face so that you can't really get away from him, and makes the case, but in a way that Wallace will accept the use of federal troops in Selma. He convinced Wallace to invite the troops, making the case to him that he definitely knows that he wants law and order, and that he would not, like to see all of this violence happening. And so it doesn't look like Johnson is sending in the troops, but it's Wallace who's requesting them. The Voting Rights Act was the speech that Dick wrote, sort of an interesting story about that. Dick didn't find out about it until like the morning of the speech. And he only had 9 hours to write it. And so he was very much under the gun. He set his watch on the desk and said, "Don't interrupt me." And he wasn't interrupted, but they needed to have it done so that they could get it on the teleprompter. So he took a break while he was writing the speech, and he went out, and there were peaceful protesters, and they were singing "We Shall Overcome." And so Dick goes back in, and he gets a call from Johnson that he said, try to remember what my early experiences were as a teacher in Texas. That he had taught Mexican American students at this school, and he saw the quality of their life, or the lack of quality in their life, and he thought, that ought to be in the speech somewhere. So Dick finally finishes the speech, and Johnson invites him to ride to the White House to deliver this speech. And I think that's worth hearing part of again. Let's see here. Rarely in any time does an issue lay bare the secret heart of America itself. Rarely are we met with a challenge not to our growth and abundance, for our welfare or our security, but rather to the values and the purposes and the meaning of our beloved nation. The issue of equal rights for American Negroes is such an issue. There is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem. And we are met here tonight as Americans, not as Democrats or Republicans. We are met here as Americans to solve that problem. Many of the issues of civil rights are very complex and most difficult, but about this there can and should be no argument. Every American must have an equal right to vote. There is no constitutional issue here. The command of the Constitution is plain. There is no moral issue. It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country. There is no issue of states' rights or national rights. There is only the struggle for human rights. But even if we pass this bill, the battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part of a larger movement which reaches at every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too, because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome, which I thought was a real stroke of genius. And towards the end of this speech, Johnson here's the suggestion that he made to Dick. My first job after college was as a teacher in Catula, Texas, in a small Mexican-American school. Few of them could speak English, and I couldn't speak much Spanish. My students were poor, and they often came to class without breakfast, hungry, and they knew, even in their youth, the pain of prejudice. They never seemed to know why people disliked them, but they knew it was so, because I saw it in their eyes. I often walked home late in the afternoon, after the classes were finished, wishing there was more that I could do. Somehow you never forget what poverty and hatred can do when you see its scars on the hopeful face of a young child. I never thought then, in 1928, that I would be standing here in 1965. It never occurred to me in my fondest dreams that I might have the chance to help the sons and daughters of those students and to help people like them all over the country. But now I do have that chance, and I'll let you in on a secret. I mean to use it. and I hope that you will use it with me. And as usual, there was thunderous applause, which I don't know how many times the speech was interrupted by applause, but that was something Johnson always liked to keep track of. But I really thought the way that went together was very effective. So I guess you might call that the high watermark of Dick's time working for the Johnson administration, and maybe for the administration itself, because of Vietnam, and how that had become more and more, occupied more and more attention and more of the president's attention. Dick, it took him a while to leave the White House. And Johnson would, always try to give him all these reasons he'd visit, and Johnson would hand him engraved cufflinks and cigarette lighters and try to persuade him to stay. But Dick wanted to return to Wesleyan College to write, and eventually he was able to do that. So that was a little bit before Doris comes into contact with Johnson and was selected to become a White House fellow. She made quite an impression on Johnson when they had the opening reception for the other White House fellows in 1967. But what he didn't know at the time was that she had collaborated with two of her friends to write a book, an article in the New Republic called How to Remove LBJ in 1968. So that hadn't been on the radar when she applied for the fellowship. And needless to say, that caused them to take a second look at Doris Kearns as a White House fellow. They looked at her FBI background report and did some investigating, and they eventually let her continue as a White House fellow. Johnson had already invited her to work alongside him in the White House. He reneged on that, and she was reassigned to work in the Labor Department, at least for a little while. She eventually does make it back to the White House, and towards the end of Johnson's presidency. So we are so way over. I'm just going to quickly, I was always curious, she made such a quick early impression on Johnson. I mean, even when they were at this reception, he invites her in, to come work with him. So, maybe he saw the talent that was in Doris Kearns. I'm just going to mention, the stint that Dick had working on the RFK's presidential campaign, and he, instead of sort of worshiping him as a hero as with JFK, I think that there was a lot more of an emotional connection between the two, and we kind of know how that was a short-lived stint. I want to, again, I'm leaving out a lot of things, but I told you to tell me when it was getting over. Eventually, Doris, this is the scene on the left, is the library in Dick and Doris's home. And when Dick finally succumbs to cancer in 2018. Doris is interested in moving out, but the question is, what do you do with all of these books? She also had an early love for libraries. Her mother died when she was 15, and she had a weak heart due to rheumatic fever, and Doris would visit the library and was really thrilled to be able to go to the adult section and pick out books for her mother that she would come back and read. So Doris, like all of us, had a love affair with libraries. So what they did was she donated a lot of the books to the library in Concord, and that's what you see on the right. It's kind of a presentation room, and with a lot of the Goodwin's books there on the side. So I've got to get to the end anyway. This is a Wordsworth poem that was one of Dick's favorites that Doris would read to him as he was slowly fading away. Though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind. And I was very much touched by that. And then kind of a parting sort of note from Dick. It's supposed to be a little inspirational. From the long view of my life, I see how history turns and veers. He had talked about the history of the United States was 3 Dick Goodwins. He was looking at history in 80-year increments. And the end of our country has loomed many times before, which is true. You think about the Great Depression, or you think about the Civil War era, you think about times even during the American Revolution. America is not as fragile as it seems. So, I don't know, it's kind of a hopeful note in view of where we are right now. I would just have one kind of caveat, and that is one thing that was not so true in much of Dick's life, that is definitely true today, is the question of truth. And we seem not to be able to agree on that. There are different versions of truth. And I think that makes our challenges a little more daunting to try to overcome. But we still need to try. So I'm curious about something in the book that might have caught your attention.
This wasn't in the book,
Or
but you started out with Jefferson. Jefferson was a geek. He spent a lot of his younger years at home reading. He was not noted for his speeches. We know him because of his writings in the Constitution, and he wasn't a great speaker at the Continental Congress or anything else like that. He was kind of quiet on the side. This gentleman, Dick, I'm hearing he was a geek, in today's terms. He wasn't it was writing for him, not speech, not thought.
That's exactly right. He was very well read. And even in conversations with either of the Kennedys, they were as well. I wouldn't say that's true of Johnson, and it's certainly not been true of every president, but I think that's a good observation.
I don't know how to explain this, but when I read the book, I realized what a great speechwriter he was. And when you read some of his words, it made me wonder, like Kennedy's speech about, what you should do for. A good speech makes the speaker
Look good.
look good. And so, like, who gets the credit? I mean, is a speechwriter.
Well, obviously, I've never really heard of Dick Goodwin before. So I think the president gets the credit. I'm thinking of, Obama, who was also known for, some of his speeches. But he had a pretty young team of speechwriters. But, I mean, that was true of Richard Goodwin, too. He was in his 20s, and I think that was true of some of Obama's writers. So I think it might be important to surround yourself, if you're president, to surround yourself with people who are well-read and can also translate what your your thoughts are or your policies are. How do you do that?
You hear this great speech and you say, oh, what a great man. But the words came from somebody else who,
I mean,
in my mind,
they
was
do
a great
make,
man.
I mean, I think, they do make revisions. It probably, however it was written, and this is probably true of any president. However it was written, that's probably not how, those are not going to be exactly the words. I think they all, do some editing. But, I mean, it's a good point. And Louise talked about, did any of you listen to the book?
Yeah, so I listened to, I did a hybrid, I listened and also read some of it. But if you get the audio book, when those speech excerpts happen, they are actually the tapes of RFK and JFK and LBJ speaking, and it's incredibly moving.
And I think that would be,
Yeah, I
fabulous,
highly
too.
recommend it.
I've got to
Unfortunately,
do
the
that.
library system does not have the audio book, but maybe quality.
Yeah. My father was a speechwriter, and his job was to really put himself in the person's shoes, as in, what's the point this person's trying to get across, what's their demeanor, how would they normally get this across, and then he'd write the words. So it was a little bit of pulling from who is this person, and I'm going to help them get their message.
And I think
Yeah, but one
and
thing
be
she
able
talks
to
about
express
is that the speechwriter is obligated to make that speech sound like that person. So writing a speech for JFK was very different from writing a speech for LBJ because they were such different people.
And the other,
Different.
another point, I don't know, maybe I'm alluding to it, I think I might not have. Dick always said that, I mean, he loved John F. Kennedy, but there was never, you never exactly knew, where you stood with him. Whereas with Johnson, you knew. If he loved what you were doing, he would let you know. If he hated what you were doing, he would let you know. So, two different personalities.
The speeches would also be the result of weeks, months, or even years of policy discussions. So it's not like the speechwriter had to come up with this out of the
Exactly.
blue.
Right.
He was summarizing a process that involved many people.
The civil rights, all that legislation had been in the works since the Kennedy years. And, I think that was another argument about, between Dick and Doris, because, Dick said, well, Kennedy should get the credit. And Doris said, well, none of that would have happened if Johnson had carried out, and made certain that those bills were made into law. So, you need inspiration, but you also need somebody who's going to act on it and make it happen. So maybe they were a good team in that way.
As I remember, it, Kennedy really didn't get anything through. It was Johnson who did all the dirt work and got everything through. And big difference.
And, Kennedy had not been in the Senate very, he didn't have a long tenure in the Senate, as had Johnson, who had been, whip and minority leader, majority leader, and he knew, he could twist arms of Republicans like Everett Dirksen or, whoever might have put up some opposition where, that was, one-on-one. I mean, I think they both agreed. He was pretty hard to go up against. It was hard to, when Doris wanted to leave, he invited her, he wanted her to help him with his memoirs at the end of the presidency and move to Texas and live on the ranch and, write his story or help him write his story. And she had planned to go to Harvard and teach this course on the presidents. And he was not going to have it. He said, she says, I want to teach, or I want to teach about the presidents. He said, well, I'm a president, and seems like to me that would be a good thing. You're working with the president, and you can teach about him. And I can get you a job at the University of Texas. If you want to teach, you can teach there. And so she didn't give in. And he said, I'll even set you up in a little cabin on a lake somewhere on the ranch. You can get up and do whatever writers do, look at the blue sky and be surrounded by nature. But she didn't give in, and he, again, I don't think he spoke to her for days because he was so upset that he hadn't been able to convince her to come to Texas. And because she had said, I'll come, I want to go teach, but I'll come on long weekends or, when there are vacations and we can work on your memoirs. But, so after, a while, I think Lady Bird must have had a few words with LBJ and softened him up a little bit. And in the end, he said to Doris, okay, part-time. So she was able to go to Harvard and work on his memoirs. And then her first book was about LBJ. So she got a little something out of it too. And here's another one of those great what-if questions in history. If she hadn't gone to Harvard, she wouldn't have met Dick. And so we might not be hearing that story either. So, anyone else? You ready?
I have a couple of things.
Okay.
Real quick. In 1954, when Dick went to Harvard Law School, the tuition was $600 a year. It's currently $71,000. One thing that this reminded me of also is how I miss the days when the conventions were actually a contest and not just an affirmation, that there was actually, you didn't know going in who was going to come out. And then this is as contrast to what we're living with today. This was following the Bay of Pigs disaster in Cuba. During the press conference later that morning, Kennedy was ready for the question about conflicting stories of blame. I'm the responsible officer of the government, he said with emphasis. There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. And that's the kind of leadership we need today.
He took the blame for that. It's my fault. You don't see that, you don't hear that very, very often.
Well, on the last quote you had, maybe this will bring, I don't mean it, I gotta say it, but I don't mean it this way. Teddy Roosevelt becoming president, McKinley shot and Butler. McKinley was owned by, his campaign was paid for by Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt. He was owned by the oligarchs. Then he gets assassinated, and then you get a totally different guy. Oh, he's gonna fight for the environment, who's gonna fight for, change was 180 degrees, so there's always hope.
And Teddy Roosevelt, he was another voracious reader. I remember stories about him. The White House staff had trouble keeping Roosevelt and his family in things to read, because they were just, they'd go through everything that was available. They didn't have television, radio, the internet. And they Any other comments or any other favorite parts of the book or impressions?
I just say that I applaud you for giving such a good review.
Oh, well, thank you. I can't tell you. I can't tell you how many times there was just so much. I don't feel like I even scratched the surface, but some of the key areas that really touched me, I tried to include. So don't forget your chocolate.